So perhaps you know the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility. It's best known from Spider-Man. Peter Parker, he's been bitten by the radioactive spider, but he's shying away from the responsibility that comes with his newfound power. He doesn't want it. And his uncle says to him, with great power comes great responsibility. And the whole film is the story of him coming to accept and embrace that truth. Well, the film I've seen, I know there's loads of them now. But the writers of Spider-Man did not come up with this themselves. Winston Churchill once said, where there is great power, there is great responsibility. Where there is less power, there is less responsibility. And where there is no power, there can, I think, be no responsibility. But let me suggest even Winston Churchill didn't come up with this idea on his own. Intentionally or not, he was tapping into something baked into the fabric of this world by our Creator God. A fundamental truth about the responsibilities of those in power. And this is the focus of today's passage in Proverbs 31. So just to kind of place us in the book of Proverbs, the bit we usually think of as Proverbs finishes at the end of chapter 29. And then the last two chapters are a little bit different. They're still taken up with words of wisdom, but not from King Solomon. Two other kings are mentioned. Chapter 30, we've got the words of Agor, son of Jakeh, and chapter 31, the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. And this is interesting. Who is this Lemuel? Who's his mother who's taught him these words? Well, he's a king, clearly, from the name, King Lemuel, but he's not an Israelite king. And we can make some guesses as to where he's from, but they're mostly conjecture. Yet the compiler of the book of Proverbs recognized this non-Israelite king's wisdom as inspired by God and worthy of inclusion in our Holy Scriptures. And that makes Proverbs 31 a really interesting chapter for us to look at in today's world, because we live in a world where many of those in power in our nation, whether that be kings or prime ministers or anyone else with influence or authority, many of them are not part of God's covenant people. They're not Christians. They don't believe Jesus Christ is Lord. Much like Pontius Pilate, they don't recognize the only reason they have authority is because it's been given to them from above. So in many ways, they're in the same shoes as King Lemuel, not part of God's covenant people, yet they have power. And with that power comes great responsibility. Responsibility especially to those with the least power, to the poor and to the weak. So today's leaders are a bit like King Lemuel of Proverbs 31. And so this Bible passage helps us as Christians to know what we can reasonably expect from our non-Christian leaders in this country. We don't expect them to think like Christians. We don't expect them to have all the same values as us and to have the same vision for society as we do. But Proverbs 31 says, well, we can expect something from them. In fact, we must expect something from them if we care about the weak and the vulnerable. So we're going to explore the passage today with 4 questions. The first 2 take us through the passage. The next one looks at Jesus. And the last one looks at ourselves. So let's start with this. Verses 1 to 5. What makes a bad leader? What makes a bad leader? Well, there's some specific things, aren't there, that King Lemuel's mother warns him about. But there's also the bigger picture and why these behaviors are such a problem. So what are the warnings? Verse 3, have a look with me. There's a warning about an excess of women. And verse 4, an excess of alcohol. In both cases, it's excess that's the problem. Verse 3, do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. Women there is plural, not singular. It's not saying that if a ruler is married, he shouldn't put any effort into the relationship. No, it's about pursuing multiple women. You see, Lemuel's mother knows that with great power, yes, comes great responsibility, but also with great power comes great opportunity. Opportunity to abuse that power, to misuse that power, to display the mindset, the mentality that others are there for your pleasure and for your benefit. And history is replete, right up to the present day, with stories of kings and rulers and presidents and prime ministers using their power to take advantage of women. So verse 3 is a warning about that. Verse 4, the other warning, it's about an excess of alcohol. It's not for kings, O Lemuel, it's not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what's been decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. This isn't about a glass of wine or not. It's not an absolutist verse that enforces teetotalism on every leader. No, it's about getting drunk to the point where you forget what you've decreed, what commands or orders you've made, the way many kings did in the Old Testament. Or drinking such that you then make bad decisions that harm the people that you're there to serve. Think of Daniel chapter 5, King Belshazzar. He got so drunk, he decided it was a good idea to go and take the sacred vessels from the temple so that he could drink from them. It leads to the writing on the wall and the end of his kingdom. Again, the danger is about becoming focused on pleasure, on self, which is easier to do now that you've got power, rather than working on the responsibilities of leadership. So a bad leader, according to Proverbs 31, is one who puts self and pleasure first. Because look at what happens when you do that. It's the end of verse 5. It's not for kings to do any of this, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. You see, a leader who is self-interested neglects the interests of others. He neglects the interests of the poor. Power is intoxicating, and the great trap for leaders then and now is to focus on gaining and preserving power instead of serving the weakest and the most vulnerable. You hear it said we shouldn't put our leaders on a pedestal, and that's a great warning because our leaders aren't Christ, and every human leader falls short and disappoints. And you hear it said, well, we can't expect non-Christian leaders to live according to our values. They're there to lead a country, not a church. Also true, but Proverbs 31 is here reminding us that there is still something we can expect from our leaders. I mentioned I've got 2 kids, 16 and 13. One's now off at college, but the 13-year-old's still at secondary school, and their school motto is service before self. That's what we can expect from our leaders, isn't it? Service before self. How can I serve the weakest, the smallest, the most vulnerable? And I'm talking in the context of our nation, but isn't it also true everywhere? Anywhere where you have a leader, even in the church. Why is the leader there? The leader is there not for self, not for self-aggrandizement, but for service. Serving others, particularly serving the weakest. But that's the negative side. That's what makes a bad leader. It's someone who focuses on self and neglects the poor and the vulnerable. Let's flip that on its head and say, well, what makes a good leader? And here we'll explore verses 6 through to 9. Start with 6 and 7. Let's just read them because you could really misinterpret these, couldn't you? Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. Now, if you read these verses the wrong way, it could lead to some interesting applications. At Care, where we work, in the realm of politics, it could lead to some interesting policy decisions. We'd have to, I think, abolish minimum alcohol pricing because that's designed to prevent binge drinking, and apparently that would be unbiblical. And instead, we'd want to give cheap alcohol to the poor instead of tax credits or something. Get people drunk and they'll forget their misery. No, we've got to understand these verses rightly if we're going to make sense of them. I think what's happening here, verses 6 and 7, it's encouraging King Lemuel to have compassion for the poor. It would be easy for him in his ivory tower to forget how the other half lived, to forget the reality that some of the people in his kingdom would be facing extreme hunger. Some or many would be living at or below the poverty line. This is reminding King Lemuel of the need for compassion. There can be great misery attached to poverty. So give strong drink. Let them drink and forget their poverty. I suppose maybe one thing King Lemuel could do would be to host a banquet from time to time and invite the poor. Let them come and forget their troubles for a night. That's what the king did in the book of Esther, chapter 1, isn't it? He gave for all the people, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So have compassion on the poor. Help them. Another way this could be interpreted is in providing care for the dying. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing. Wine to those in bitter distress. It's the invention of palliative care. Strong medicine to ease their passing. Many people think actually this is behind a detail in the crucifixion story. As Jesus is making his way to the cross, they offer him wine mixed with myrrh. And it was common practice to give strong drink to numb the pain of being crucified. So verses 6 and 7, we can say to the leaders of today, just because you have it good, don't ignore the pain and suffering that others are facing on a daily basis. Don't become detached from the reality of poverty and misery that many people endure day by day. But more clear, I think, verses 8 and 9, what makes a good leader. And verses 8 and 9 are why I picked this passage. These verses are iconic. These are kind of manifesto verses. They should be engraved on the desk of any leader anywhere in the world, every leader everywhere in the world, to say to them, this is why you're here. This is how your leadership will be judged. According to verses 8 and 9 of Proverbs chapter 31 in this book called the Bible, verses 8 and 9, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. See, it's not just about having compassion for the poor, but it's compassion that leads to action on their behalf. Defend them. Speak up for the weak. Who are the ones who cannot speak for themselves? In the Old Testament, there's 4 groups mentioned again and again. They're sometimes called the quartet of the vulnerable. It's those who've got no social power. They often live at subsistence level. They're closest to starvation if famine or invasion or social unrest come about. And that those 4 groups, again and again, you hear about them in the Old Testament. The poor, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. They're referenced so many times in the Bible. It's as if, well, he does. God has a special heartbeat for them. And at Care, this is what drives a lot of our work. We like to identify, well, who are the most vulnerable? Who are the weakest today? We know that all are equal in the eyes of the law, yet there are some groups, some people, whether that's because of where they're born or the color of their skin or the disability they may have or because they're at the very beginning or the very end of life, there are some people who seem to be that little bit further away from getting just outcomes in their lives. All humans are equal, but some are more equal than others, is often the way it goes. And God sees this and God knows this. It's not fair. But he places the responsibility not on the poor to look after themselves, to stand up for themselves. You make it fair. No, it's on the leaders. It's on the rulers. It's on those in power to stand up for the rights of the poor. Did you see the words rights in this passage? 3 times. Verses 5, 8, and 9, we're told about the rights of the afflicted in verse 5, the rights of the destitute in verse 8, the rights of the poor and needy in verse 9. See, rights aren't some kind of modern invention. They're a God-given reality. What rights do they have? They have the right to life, the right to freedom, the right to be treated the same way as the rich and the powerful. Elsewhere in Proverbs, we're told someone who deprives the poor of his rights is actually insulting God. So what makes a good leader? Well, very simply from this passage, it's someone who stands up for the weak, the poor, the destitute. Someone who is a voice for the voiceless. Our third question this morning, 3 out of 4, is this: who is the best leader? No surprises here. The answer is not Matt Neal. No offense, Matt. Do a little poll. Who's the best leader? And you just have the names of all your elders. No, don't try that. The best leader, Sunday school answer, Jesus. But let me show you why the answer is Jesus with reference to Proverbs 31 and what we've already seen. Well, we've seen a good leader puts service before self. And Jesus taught his disciples, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave among all. And then he points to himself as having done this. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Service before self to the extreme that he will give his own life. On top of that, Jesus' kingdom is good news for the poor and the marginalized and the destitute. In Luke 4, when he preaches at the synagogue in Nazareth, he reads from Isaiah, and then he controversially announces, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Well, what scripture was he quoting? It's this: it's the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, of course, we read that spiritually. He proclaimed liberty to those who were captive in sin. He gave sight to those who were blind and unable to see God. But it's not only spiritual. He did also set at liberty those who were oppressed. He gave sight to the blind. He loved the poor. I think you've been going through Luke's gospel. You'll have seen this again and again. His kingdom is good news for the poor, and he had a particular concern for those who were on the margins of society, for those who didn't have a voice of their own. Voiceless because they were literally unable to speak, mute. Or voiceless because they were excluded from society, maybe leprosy. Or voiceless because of their life choices, tax collectors, prostitutes. He was the friend of the destitute. Jesus is the wonderful king described in Psalm 72. It says, he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy. He saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence, he redeems their life. Precious is their blood in his sight. And Jesus, his is the kingdom of future justice that we will look forward to. The one where justice rolls like rivers, as Matt was saying in his kids' talk. No injustice, no more that's not fair when he comes back. And I just want us to take a moment and say, wow, isn't this a beautiful picture? Isn't Jesus, our Savior, isn't he wonderful? This is our God. This is who he is. This is what he's like. And he saved us, didn't he, by dying on the cross for our sins. And even on the cross, Proverbs 31 comes into view. Because as he went to the cross, he was the destitute one. He was the weak. He was the poor. He identified with us. He was offered wine mixed with myrrh. They were looking to minister to him, weren't they? To give strong drink to the one who's perishing and wine to the one in bitter distress. He was in anguish and he was offered that drink just to numb a little bit the pains and the agonies of crucifixion. Yet he's also in the other part of Proverbs 31, because on this occasion he was the king who refused to take that drink. It's not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to take strong drink. Again, not sinful to drink alcohol, but on the cross, he was being crowned as our king. He was dying for us. He was receiving the wrath of God in our place and wanted nothing to dull his senses for what was the most important moment in human history. Just to clarify, he did later drink a sour wine vinegar while on the cross, but that was a thirst-quenching beverage rather than a sense-numbing beverage. And on the cross, Jesus gave up his rights. He went further than just defending our rights. He gave us what was not our right. He gave us what we didn't deserve, which is that forgiveness of sins for all who have faith in him. So who's the best leader? It is Jesus, and he is worthy of our praise. Well, let's close with one final question and look at ourselves, his followers. We're not all leaders. We don't have the influence of King Lemuel or an MP or PM. In the church, yes, there are leaders, and there are certainly lessons for the leaders to learn from this passage, but even for those who have no leadership. Part of being a Christian is being conformed into the image of Jesus. It's being made more like him, isn't it? We become like our King. And so if justice is the foundation of his throne, then we should be people who pursue justice, who care about justice. When we have the opportunity, we stand up for the rights of those who are trodden on. This isn't an optional extra, it's part of the Christian life. It's what we're all about at CARE. We've talked about that, promoting justice at the parliamentary level, but what might Proverbs 31 look like in your life? In church, it's about treating everyone justly and fairly. It's not, there's a whole section in James about not looking to certain people and saying, oh, you've got lots of money and you dress nicely, you come and sit at the front and you, well, no, it's loving everyone. It's treating everyone as made in the image of God. But outside the church, looking again at kind of the national situation, it's engaging with those leaders we do have and writing to them about issues of justice. Write to your MP, write letters full of truth and grace, write letters that overflow with the fruit of the Spirit. Christians aren't always wonderful at this when writing to our politicians, but write letters that are full of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, and let them know you're praying for them. And write to your MP on a range of issues. I was talking with Christian MP Tim Farron the other week, and he was saying how he finds it frustrating that Christians don't write to him on a range of issues. He'll get lots of letters about marriage and abortion and that kind of thing, and that's fine. He's not saying that that's bad, but he's saying, where are the letters on domestic violence? Where are the letters about those trapped in gambling addiction through the predatory tactics of some of those companies? Let's be people who care about justice in all its forms and not just on a narrow range of issues. So pray for your MP, pray for your MP, pray for your local leaders. And again, sorry for the plug. If you sign up to our mailing list, that'll always keep you up to date with what to be praying for. Vote for leaders. We'll probably have an election in the next 12 months. Vote for leaders who are best equipped to fulfill this Proverbs 31 manifesto. Now, that doesn't mean you have to vote for Party A or Party B. Even if I wanted to start talking about that, I wouldn't, because I think that would be a breach of charity law. But nonetheless, we all weigh up differently the factors behind what justice looks like, and who are the most vulnerable in society, and whose rights are most trampled on, and what's the best way to seek justice, and which party is best able to deliver justice, and what about the local candidate versus the national party? They're not easy questions, and different Christians will come to different conclusions. But what I'm saying is, let Proverbs 31 and verses 8 and 9, let them at least be a factor that influences the direction of your vote. Or maybe it's more hands-on than that. Every place is different, every community is different, but who are the marginalized around here? Who's excluded in this community, in Trowbridge? Who's vulnerable? Who seems to have their rights trampled on a little bit? No one person can solve all of those problems, but as we remember that every human is made in the image of God, let's be people that love our neighbor as ourselves. And then lastly, as we're being made more like our leader, Jesus, let's be people who stand up against injustice when we see it. That might be in the workplace, that might be in school. Ask God to give you eyes to see what's happening around you and wisdom to know when you can help and what you can do.